Welcome to the disconcerting spectacle of William Davenant, who was a theatre producer, a playwright and a poet in the 17th century. Great fan of Ben Jonson, great fan of William Shakespeare. This is part of a series which you'll find uploaded onto my YouTube channel. Very repetitive names, but the point is being made that all of these contemporaries of William Shakespeare knew perfectly well that that name was being used by Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, as a pseudonym. The other thing that comes out of these, and I hope you'll have a look at them all, because what they do is very much corroborate the evidence that Shakespeare was a pseudonym. They also corroborate the evidence that saying so in those days was prohibited from overt expression. And so each of these people went about telling you or preserving the truth of Shakespeare's identity in a rather cryptic way. Some of them repeat each other using the same techniques. Others are quite original about the way they go about it. But do have a look at these presentations. They're not only good fun, but I think they present the case with unassailable force. Once one's looking at actual contemporaries and what they're saying about who Shakespeare was, it really does make modern-day Ing-lit professors look way behind, as if they know more than the contemporaries. It's a ridiculous idea. So to William Davenant and his collection of poems called Madagascar, published in 1638, but we're looking at a poem that was written in the mid-1620s. Appears on page 7 of this 37, and it's called In Remembrance of Master William Shakespeare. It appears in 3 short verses, and I'm going to read them through with a little bit of emphasis on the theme which you'll notice runs through each of the 3 verses. And that theme is the theme of darkness, of the deprivation of light, which on a surface meaning is referring to mourning, the death of Shakespeare. But you'll see very clearly as you read this through that in fact it's also talking about ignorance, darkness of ignorance, about warning to use your eyes, to look, to spy, do not allow your eyes to be deceived, etc. So let's just read it through for its surface meaning. Beware, delighted poets, when you sing to welcome nature in the early spring, your numerous feet not tread the banks of Avon, for each flower, as it ne'er knew a sun or shower, hangs there the pensive head. Each tree whose thick and spreading growth hath made rather a night beneath the boughs than shade, unwilling now to grow, looks like the plume a captive wears, whose rifled falls are steeped in the tears which from his last rage flow. The piteous river wept itself away, long since, alas, to such a swift decay, that reach the map, and look if you a river there can spy, and for a river your mocked eye will find a shallow brook. So as I said, the standard Stratfordian professor's exegesis of that is simply to say everyone's mourning the death of Shakespeare, but clearly there's a lot more to it. There always is a lot more to these things. They wrote very deeply, poets in this era, and straight away you can see from that last verse, when you're talking about a mocked eye, why you're talking about a mocked eye if all we're saying is we are sad that Shakespeare is dead. If you go back to the beginning, then obviously we start with the stark warning: beware, delighted poets. I pronounce it like that because that's what it means. We're talking about deprived of light, not delighted as in chocolate delight. This is more like decongested or desalinated. It's having the light taken away. The light is gone. And I'll come back to that in just a second, but the point is he's saying, beware, delighted poets, your eyes will be mocked if you tread the banks of Avon in remembrance of Master William Shakespeare. So this idea of having mocked eyes or not being able to see clearly in relation to William Shakespeare, this is clearly something that was started off by Ben Jonson in his famous tribute to Shakespeare in the first folio of 1623, when he says he refuses to praise Shakespeare's name. And one of the reasons he gives is concerns blind affection, which doth ne'er advance the truth, but gropes and urgeth all by chance. Blind affection. This is what the modern Stratfordian professor is afflicted with. He cannot see. He gropes towards the truth because his affection for the Stratfordian myth is such that he simply can't advance. So back to the poem, we've got this idea of your mocked eye, or your eyes will be mocked if you tread the banks of Avon, in remembrance of William Shakespeare. And this idea of light, which seems to recur, the flowers as it ne'er knew sun or shower. I think we're looking at a sort of cross-reference to Apollo here. Remember, Apollo sends a shower to save Croesus when he's burning, and Apollo is, of course, the sun, known as Phoebus Apollo, represents the sun. And in the second verse, we're talking about how it seems like a permanent night rather than just a shade under those trees. So the idea that the death of Shakespeare is the putting out of the sun, of Phoebus Apollo. Well, try as you might, nobody has ever found the slightest bit of evidence to show that William of Stratford was ever likened to Phoebus Apollo, or to the sun, or to a great light, but we have many references, of course, to Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, in that way. George Chapman, famous playwright of the day, wrote of Oxford that he was liberal as the sun, spoke and writ sweetly. When he says liberal as the sun, he doesn't mean liberal in the political sense. He's, of course, talking about liberal in the sense of being a great patron, being generous, providing heat, rays, light above all, to learned people. And 'twas the Earl of Oxford, this liberal as the sun. I think I've already shown you this contemporary who takes the Latinization of Edward de Vere's name, Eduardus Verus, and makes an anagram out of it, aure sordus video, which means with deaf ear I see. The joke, of course, is with de Vere I see, but the point I'm making here is I see, with de Vere I see. By de Vere my path is lighted, my understanding, my knowledge. De Vere, remember, was this extraordinary scholar as well as a great playwright, but it's the idea that his eyes are opened by de Vere. And Thomas Nash in 1596, who talks of de Vere as our patron, our Phoebus, Phoebus again, the sun, the god of the sun. A wonderful little bit of praise to de Vere here. Of course, by 1596, completely lost all the money he had when he was young, gone practically bankrupt. And Nash says of him, de Vere, to whom I wish no better fortune than the forelocks of fortune he had hold of in his youth, and no higher fame than he hath purchased himself by his pen, being the first in our language I have encountered that repurified poetry from art's pedantism, and that instructed it to speak courtly, our patron, our Phoebus. Our first Orpheus, or quintessence of invention he is. This use of our, I want you to hold a little memory of that, because it's going to come up with relation to Davenant. Finally, this very famous engraving, we all know this, Droeshout's engraving from the 1623 First Folio. But back to the idea of Edward de Vere being a masked writer who was Phoebus Apollo. If you look carefully at this, what are we looking at? We're looking at the mask of a player, an actor, but shining through the mask. Look at his forehead there, the huge endeavour that Droeshout has done to give the brightest light coming from the centre of the forehead. That's obviously the sun's rays, which you see there on his collar, the stiff collar, with 2 rays on the left and 4 rays beaming out from the right. A little a tilt of respect towards Vere's wonderful knowledge of languages, de Vere, for in French and German, de Vere, his name, but he's Phoebus Apollo, the mask of Apollo. Okay, I think I've probably said enough about the light motif, as it were, of this poem. We're looking at the second verse and comparing the trees on the banks of Avon that look like the plume a captive wears, whose rifled falls, that's feathers, by the way, it's a military or heraldic feathers, whose rifled falls are steeped in the tears from which his last rage flow. A very clear image there of a defeated soldier who is essentially robbed. Rifled means robbed, ransacked of his feathers, i.e. of his military and national identity. It's a grab on his identity, obviously very clearly connected to the idea of Shakespeare of Stratford wrongly taking the identity of the poet who wrote Shakespeare's works. The key to all these things nearly always lies at the end, and that's certainly the case here in the third verse. Let's see if we can untangle it. The piteous river wept itself away long since, alas, to such a swift decay, that reach the map and look if you a river there can spy, and for a river your mocked eye will find a shallow brook. So the one thing that's very clear from that verse is he's asking you to look, to spy, warning you against having a mocked eye. What's he asking you to look for? He's asking you to look for a river. Why is he asking you to spy and look for that? Can we see a river in this verse? Yes, we can, of course. There are 3 rivers. Now, is it a sheer coincidence that river happens to end in the name of the fellow who wrote the works of Shakespeare, Vere, 3 times? Vere, Vere, Vere. Is that a coincidence? Is that what Davenant is actually asking us to look for? If it is the case, then he's not being wholly original, I have to say. In fact, quite a few people made the same trick. Here's a poem by Richard Barmfield, published in 1598. And again, you can see that connection between Shakespeare and his name, and Vere, 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 3 times, in each case hidden in another word, ever, ever, and never there. I think I've already shown you this very remarkable example of epigram by Thomas Porter, in which he has Shakespeare, nomen ubique tuum, your name is all around, Vere, 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 3 times. Actually, it's a little game that Edward de Vere himself liked to play. Here's a poem by him in an original manuscript, not alas his handwriting, but it is his poem. It is entitled The Best Verse That Ever the Author Made. A little clue to who the author is, E. Vere, hidden in ever. Just in case you didn't get that little joke, then you can look to the bottom where it is subscribed, ever, or E. Vere. And if you really still don't get that joke and think it's all just a coincidence, then start reading the poem, and about halfway along you see that it turns into an echo poem. So he takes fever and rhymes it Vere. Ever, well, we've had that one forever. Vere. Quiver, he rhymes Vere. Deliver, he echoes Vere. Echo, echo, echo. So you see what he's doing. He's pointing out his name concealed in words like quiver, deliver, fever, etc. So that's exactly the same as we seem to find Davenant doing here in river. So the question is, if Davenant is deliberately pointing us to those veers at the end of river, do we get any better sense of the poem, which, if you remember, we've been told, be careful, beware, delighted poets, of going to Avon, the banks of Avon, and then we're ending up with this. Now, look just before the word veer on those last 2 occasions. You get that huge capital R and preceded by an A. The question is Davenant deliberately talking about our Vere? Do you remember I've just shown you about all those our patron, our Phoebus? It's a great use of that personal pronoun to honour somebody. Our nation's poet is very often a name of a poet. For instance, Markham and Covell, both contemporaries, who talk of our Vere. Ascham in 1570 talks of our Chaucer. Purkis in 1613 of our Spenser. I'm sure many of you will know Diggs's reference to our Shakespeare in the 1623 folio, and Bellasis, our Fletcher, our Donne, our Sidney, etc., etc., etc. It was so common to call a great poet our that I think we do deserve to give some time and respect to the idea that here we have a great capital R and A before it R, which is punning with our. Now, if we're doing that, and if Davenant wants us to do that, does it now make sense? And look, if you our Vere there can spy, and for our Vere, in other words, instead of our Vere, your mocked eye will find a shallow brook. Now, the only problem we've got here is this last line. If we are being asked to see if we can find our Vere along the banks of the Avon, then surely we're mixing our metaphors very badly. If we suddenly have a last line saying, well, you won't find our Vere, all you'll find is a trickling little brook. That's not going to make much sense. So how do we make sense of that last line to avoid the mixed metaphor? Very kindly, Davenant gives us a whopping great clue about what we're supposed to do about this by instructing us in the 3rd line to reach the map. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to get out a map and see if we can make a little better sense of this shallow brook. So there we have Stratford super Avon, Stratford on Avon, the river Avon. which, if you follow it up in a northeasterly direction, comes to the town of Warwick. So I'll just show you a slightly bigger version of a map from the same age, mid-17th century. There you have Stratford sup Avon and Warwick, which is about 8 or 9 miles to the northeast on the River Avon. Why am I showing you Warwick? Is a suggestion that by the time the river gets to Avon, it's only a shallow brook. Absolutely not. In fact, the river flows the other way. It flows from Warwick to Stratford, and it is a very deep river at Warwick. There it is, nice picture of the deep river Avon. And look what's behind it. That enormous house is actually Warwick Castle. And when Davenant wrote his poem talking about shallow brooks, that castle was the seat of none other than Sir Fulke Greville, 1st Lord Brook, servant to Queen Elizabeth, counsellor to King James, and friend to Sir Philip Sidney. Brook was indeed a shallow poet, certainly a very shallow poet in comparison to Shakespeare. And as I say, he lives upon the Avon. So if we come back to this poem, I think we can at last make some sense of it. That beware the banks of Avon if you're going there in remembrance of Master William Shakespeare. Reach for the map and look if you our veer there can find, and for our veer your mocked eye will find a shallow brook. So that, I think, at last becomes very clear what he's talking about. I think it looks like Davenant had some animosity against Shallow Brook. In point of fact, he worked for Shallow Brook at some time, so nobody would have known better about Shallow Brook having a place on the Avon. No one would have known better either about Shallow Brook's house in London, and this adds a whole layer of irony to what we've been looking at. When Davenant wrote his poem, this was Brook's house in London. You can see it's called Brook House at Hackney. It was called Brook House by Brook himself. He bought it in 1609 and changed its name to Brook House. Who did he buy it from? Well, you've probably guessed. He bought it from the widow of the Earl of Oxford. This was the house where Oxford lived, Edward de Vere, from about 1591 until his death in 1604. This is where Edward de Vere died. And it's an exciting thought. We're looking at this picture by Wenceslas Holler, dated 1642, so only about 30 years after Brook bought it from the Veres. So I imagine not very much has actually changed in this picture from the days when Vere was living here, and Oxfordians believe that he was revising the Shakespeare plays. Othello, Hamlet, such things were being revised behind these windows. So we do have not only a huge sense of irony. If you knocked on Edward de Vere's house at the time when Davenant wrote this poem, the door would have been opened by Shallow Brook. And you can see on the porch there that Shallow Brook has put his coat of arms. I don't know whether Oxford's coat of arms was originally on there. But again, when we're looking at that poem of Davenant and talking about how the plumes have been plundered, there's a deep sense of irony and perhaps a little sadness. It's a splendid house, this. If you look through the arch just above that gentleman's head, you can see what looks like the beginning of a great courtyard. In fact, there were 2 courtyards in this house. And you can see how beautiful it was, and a chapel and a hall. Going long way back, it was the house of Thomas Cromwell. So a very, very important and interesting house, which is no longer there to be seen. Because why? Because very silly people called Hackney Borough Council, I imagine, decided it wasn't interesting enough and smashed it up. Here it is, just being smashed up in about 1960. And they smashed it up in order to replace the exact site with a roundabout. What fun. There it is. And it's called the Lee Bridge roundabout in Hackney, on precisely the site where Edward de Vere lived, where Shakespeare lived, and where he produced these wonderful immortal plays. Could there be more of an irony? We've just been looking at a poem which said, "Beware, delighted poets, beware, Hackney Borough Council." You have been very badly informed by the Ing-lit professors who in their ignorance did not understand that what we're looking at, this dismal concrete site, is actually the site where some of the greatest literature of the whole world was produced. But is it memorialized? No. It makes one want to cry up to heaven and call to Apollo to send some signal to the blind passers-by of what once happened on this extraordinary, important and happy site. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you will not only watch some of the earlier presentations that I've already uploaded, but subscribe and press the little bell next to the subscription so that you can be notified each time there's a new presentation uploaded. Thank you for watching.